Elena Torres walked into that storage auction with $27 to her name. Not to bid, not to buy, but simply to stay warm. Homeless, exhausted, and living out of her car with her 7-year-old son, she had stopped believing in miracles. Survival was all she had left. But then it happened. A long-abandoned storage unit came up, and not a single bidder wanted it. The auctioneer dropped the price again and again, until it hit $27, the exact amount in Elena's pocket. Everyone else saw worthless junk while Elena saw a chance for survival. She raised her hand. Laughter filled the room. They thought she'd just thrown away her last dollar on garbage. They had no idea what was hidden behind that false wall. What Elena uncovered inside would eventually be valued at over $80 million. The secret legacy of a reclusive tech genius who had quietly disappeared from the world, intentionally leaving his life's work for someone who was truly made to handle it. This is the unbelievable true story of how one desperate homeless mother's $27 gamble transformed her life into becoming a millionaire. Before we begin, drop your city in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. And don't miss the next story. Make sure you subscribe to Tailcraft. The frost on the windshield had turned into tiny rivers of condensation by the time Elena Torres opened her eyes that morning. For a confused, merciful moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then reality crashed back, the cramped driver's seat, the ache in her neck, the sound of her 7-year-old son, David, breathing softly in the back seat, wrapped in every blanket they owned. This was day 94 of living in their 2007 Toyota Camry. Through the fogged windows, she could see the first pale light of dawn cutting across the parking lot of Morrison's supermarket. They had found this spot 6 weeks ago, tucked behind the loading docks where the overnight security guard rarely bothered to check. It wasn't home, but it was safe, and these days, safety was a luxury Elena could no longer take for granted. She reached for her phone screen, cracked from when she dropped it 2 weeks ago, and checked the battery. 4%. 37 unread text messages. Bills she couldn't pay. Her sister asking if she was okay, each message more urgent than the last. Elena didn't respond. What could she possibly say? She opened her wallet and counted what was left. $27. 2 crumpled 10s, a 5, and 2 ones. The gas gauge showed a quarter tank. She had become an expert in survival math. $5 for gas, $2 for bread, $3 for peanut butter. These were the calculations that kept them alive, but not really living. In the back seat, David stirred. Elena watched him in the rearview mirror, her heart breaking. He was still so small, his face peaceful in sleep. He should have been waking up in his own bed, excited about school and friends. Instead, he was waking up in a car, wearing the same clothes for the 3rd day, because the laundromat cost money they didn't have. She had told him they were on an adventure, and he had believed her. But lately, she could see the questions starting to form in his eyes, the growing awareness that something was wrong. "Mom?" David's voice was small and sleepy. "Good morning, sweetheart," Elena said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Did you sleep okay?" David sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked around the car, and Elena watched reality hit him. But he didn't complain. He never complained. "Are we going somewhere today?" he asked. Elena's throat tightened. The truth was, she needed to find work. Any work. A listing mentioned someone needing help moving furniture for $20, starting at 2 in the afternoon. But that left them with hours to kill. Hours in which she needed to keep David warm without spending money. That's when she remembered the flyer she'd seen taped to a telephone pole. Something about a storage unit auction at Clearwater Storage Center. Public welcome. Free admission. Viewing starts at 10 a.m. Free admission meant a warm building. A place to sit where nobody would bother them. Where David could use a real bathroom. Where they could exist for just a brief moment, like normal people. Elena had never been to an auction before, had no interest in bidding on anything, but she knew how to blend in. They could sit in the back, pretend to be interested, and leave when it was over. "Get ready, sweetheart," Elena said. "We're going to see people bid on mystery boxes, like a real-life treasure hunt." David's face brightened, and Elena felt the familiar stab of guilt. They stopped at a fast food restaurant to use the bathroom. Elena washed her face in the sink, trying to make herself look presentable. The fluorescent lights were harsh, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. The way her clothes hung loose. She looked like exactly what she was, someone barely holding on. By 9:45, they arrived at Clearwater Storage Center. The facility was large, with rows of blue metal doors stretching back from a small office building. A handwritten sign directed them to a heated warehouse behind the office. Elena parked far from the entrance and grabbed David's hand. Inside, the warehouse was blessedly warm. Rows of folding chairs faced a small platform where a man in his 60s, wearing a battered cowboy hat, was organizing papers. Elena chose seats near the back, close to the exit. Then she saw at a table near the entrance, offering free coffee and cookies. Her vision blurred. Such a small thing, but it nearly brought her to tears. She grabbed 2 cookies and gave one to David. He ate it in small, savoring bites that told her exactly how hungry he really was. At exactly 10 o'clock, the auctioneer stepped up to the podium and smiled. "Good morning, folks. My name is Dale Freeman, and welcome to today's auction." Elena settled into her chair, David warm beside her. For the next few hours, they would be okay. She had no idea that in less than an hour, she would make a decision that would change both their lives forever. Dale Freeman had the kind of voice that filled a room warm, confident, with a hint of showmanship that made even the most mundane items sound exciting. He explained the rules with practiced ease. Each storage unit would be opened briefly for viewing, then bidding would start. Payment was cash or cashier's check only, and buyers had 48 hours to clear out their units. No refunds, no exceptions, all sales final. Elena listened with half her attention, mainly focused on staying warm and keeping David entertained. She had no intention of bidding, but watching other people compete over boxes of someone else's discarded belongings was at least distracting. The first few units were unremarkable. A collection of old furniture sold for $75. A unit full of sports equipment went for $120. Then a grandmother's estate packed with china and linen sparked a bidding war between 2 women, eventually settling at $350. David watched with fascination, whispering questions about why people wanted old stuff, whether there might be real treasure inside. Then Dale's voice changed, carrying a note of theatrical excitement. "Now, folks, this next one is special. Unit 189. The energy in the room shifted noticeably. Elena saw several people sit up straighter, whispering to their neighbors with sudden interest. Dale wheeled open the large metal door with a dramatic flourish. This particular unit has an unusual history. It was rented back in 2008 by a man named Alexander Reed. Some of you might recognize that name-tech entrepreneur, pioneer in biotechnology and artificial intelligence. He founded NeuroSync Technologies, was on the cutting edge of brain-computer interface research. Elena felt a small ripple of interest despite herself. A Billionaire storage unit. It sounded like something from a movie. Mr. Reed paid in advance for 15 years, Dale continued. Then he essentially vanished. Left no forwarding address, no contact information. The prepayment ran out 6 months ago, and despite extensive efforts to locate Mr. Reed or any representatives, nobody responded. So here we are. According to state abandoned property laws, this unit is now up for auction. The crowd pressed forward to look inside. Elena stayed in her seat, holding David back, but she could see enough. The unit was packed floor to ceiling, with items covered in dust and cobwebs, mid-century modern furniture, large wooden crates, stacks of plastic bins, rolled-up papers, various pieces of electronic equipment that looked ancient even to her untrained eye. It looked like someone had packed up quickly and never come back. Dale stepped back and clasped his hands together. "All right, let's start the bidding at $5,000. Silence. Nobody moved. Elena almost laughed at the absurdity. $5,000 might as well have been $5 million to her. Dale smiled him slightly. $4,000? Still nothing. $3,000? His voice carried a note of surprise now. "Come on, folks. This is a Billionaire's storage unit. Could be anything in those boxes?" The crowd remained silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but not a single hand went up. Elena began to understand. These were experienced bidders, people who knew that storage units often cost more to clear out than the contents were worth. A Billionaire's abandoned unit sounded romantic, but the reality was 15 years of dust, potentially broken electronics, and old furniture that might not be worth hauling away. They saw dollar signs and labor hours, and the math wasn't adding up. $2,000? Dale tried again, scanning the room hopefully. Nothing. $1,000? The pause stretched longer. Someone in the third row coughed. $500? Dale's theatrical energy was fading into genuine frustration. Still no takers. People were waiting for the price to drop to basically nothing, hoping someone else would take the risk. $200? Silence. $150? Nothing. Dale looked around the room with an expression of disbelief. Then he did something Elena would replay in her mind 1,000 times. He looked directly at his notes, then back at the crowd, and said with a hint of desperation, $27. Do I hear $27 for Unit 189? Contents of a Billionaire's storage unit, all the mystery and potential therein. $27, folks. The number hit Elena like an electric shock. $27. Exactly what she had in her wallet. It was David who turned to look at her, his eyes wide and hopeful. "Mom," he whispered, "that's treasure money." Elena stared at the unit, at the dusty furniture and forgotten boxes, at 15 years of abandonment and mystery. Her logical mind screamed that this was insane, that $27 was all they had, that it was supposed to buy gas for the moving job this afternoon, supposed to buy David dinner, supposed to keep them alive for another few days. But another part of her mind, the part that had been slowly dying over 3 months of sleeping in a car, whispered something different. You literally have nothing left to lose. Her hand went up before her conscious mind could stop it. The room went completely silent. Every head turned to look at her. Elena felt her face flush hot. Suddenly aware of how she must look, the homeless woman with unkempt hair and wrinkled clothes, raising her hand for a Billionaire's abandoned junk. Someone in the front row laughed. Not cruelly, but with genuine amusement at the absurdity of the moment. Dale blinked at her in surprise, then recovered with professional speed. "I have $27. He called out, his voice rising with renewed energy. "Do I hear 30? Anyone? $30? He scanned the room hopefully. Nobody moved. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and thick. A woman near the front muttered, "Let her have it," and a few people chuckled. "Going once for $27, Dale said. Going twice, double quotes, he paused, gave the crowd one more chance. Then he brought his hand down. Sold to the lady in the back for $27. Someone started clapping slowly, sarcastically, and a few others joined in. Elena felt her stomach drop. What had she just done? She had just spent their last $27 on a storage unit full of junk she couldn't move, couldn't sell, couldn't do anything with. David tugged her sleeve, his face glowing with excitement. "We won, Mom. We won the treasure." Elena looked down at him and felt her eyes start to burn. She hadn't won anything. She had just made their desperate situation impossibly worse. but she couldn't let him see her panic. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, forcing a smile. "We won. Now let's go see what's inside." Dale called her forward. Elena walked to the front on shaking legs, David practically bouncing beside her. She pulled out her wallet and counted out $27 in crumpled bills and loose change, placing it on the table like an offering. Dale counted it carefully, nodded, and handed her a receipt and a key. "Congratulations," he said, and she couldn't tell if he was sincere or pitying. "You've got 48 hours to clear it out." He paused, then added more gently, "Good luck, miss." Elena took the key, her hand trembling. The auction continued with the next unit, people already moving on from the spectacle she'd created. She walked back to collect David, then led him outside into the cold air. She stood in the parking lot for a long moment, staring at the key in her hand. She had just gambled their survival on an impulse, on a wild hope, on $27 and a room full of dust. And now she had to live with that choice. Unit 189 was at the far end of the facility, tucked back in a corner away from the main buildings. Elena walked slowly, her mind still reeling from what she'd just done. David ran ahead, then circled back, asking questions she barely heard. The key felt heavy in her hand, like it weighed more than just a few ounces of metal. When they reached the unit, she stood in front of the blue metal door for several seconds, unable to move. Behind this door was either the biggest mistake of her life or... What? What was she even hoping for? "Open it, Mom." David tugged at her jacket. Elena inserted the key with trembling fingers and rolled up the door. It moved smoothly despite its age, revealing the packed interior in full daylight. It looked even more overwhelming than it had from the warehouse. 15 years of stored belongings stretched before her, everything covered in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs stretching across corners, the smell of stale air and old paper hitting her immediately. The space was maybe 10 feet by 15 feet, packed floor to ceiling with the remnants of someone's abandoned life. "Wait," Elena said, grabbing David's hand before he could rush inside. "Let me check it first." She didn't know what she was checking for, exactly, maybe rats or structural issues, but she needed to impose some kind of order on this chaos. She stepped carefully into the unit, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. The furniture was along the left wall, a mid-century desk and chair, a small filing cabinet, a bookshelf. All clearly expensive ones, but showing their age now. The wooden crates were stacked in the center, labeled with handwritten tags that had faded to illegibility. The plastic bins lined the right wall, some clear and showing papers inside, others opaque and mysterious. Elena moved deeper into the space, stepping over a fallen stack of magazines. Most of this was worthless to her, she realized quickly. She had no way to transport heavy furniture, no place to store it, no means to sell it. The electronics looked ancient desktop computers from the early 2000s, monitors with thick backs, tangled cables. Maybe there was something valuable in the papers, she thought without much hope. Maybe Alexander Reed had left behind some documents that a historian might want, though that seemed like desperate wishful thinking. "Can I come in?" David called from the entrance. "Stay by the door, sweetheart. Don't want you tripping on anything." Elena continued her exploration, moving toward the back of the unit where the crates were stacked highest. One crate had partially collapsed, its wooden slats separated enough that she could see metal equipment inside circuit boards and wires, completely meaningless to her. She was about to turn away, about to accept that she had just thrown away their last money on genuine junk, when something caught her eye. A slight irregularity in the back wall. Elena moved closer, her heart beginning to beat faster. The unit's rear wall was plywood, standard for storage facilities. But there was a section, about 3 feet wide, where the plywood looked slightly different, newer, cleaner than the surrounding panels. She ran her hand along the edge. Her fingers found a tiny gap, barely visible, where the panel didn't quite meet the wall studs. She pressed gently. The panel shifted. Elena's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't standard construction. This was something added, something hidden, a false wall. She looked around frantically for something to pry with, finding a flathead screwdriver in a toolbox near the front. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "What are you doing, Mom?" David asked. "Just checking something," she said, her voice distant and distracted. Elena wedged the screwdriver into the gap and applied pressure. The panel resisted for a moment, then suddenly gave way with a cracking sound that made her flinch. The panel swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow space behind it, maybe 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Inside that space were more boxes, but these were different. These boxes were sealed with tape, labeled with careful handwriting, stacked with obvious intention. Not forgotten, not abandoned, hidden. Elena pulled out the first box with trembling hands. It was surprisingly heavy. She set it down and peeled back the tape, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Inside were leather-bound journals, dozens of them, all filled with dense handwriting and technical diagrams. She opened one at random and saw page after page of notes about artificial intelligence, neural networks, biotechnology applications, none of which she understood, but all of which looked detailed and deliberate. The handwriting was precise, almost beautiful. These weren't random notes. This was serious research. Elena set that box aside and pulled out another. This one contained electronic equipment, but not the dated computers from the main unit. These were small devices, sleek and minimalist prototypes of some kind. Each was carefully wrapped in anti-static material and labeled with tags describing their function in technical language she couldn't decipher. Her hands were shaking so badly now she could barely grip the third box. Inside were encrypted hard drives, at least a dozen of them, each labeled with codes and dates. Beneath those were manila folders stuffed with papers, patent applications, technical specifications, business plans. And at the very bottom, in a sealed envelope marked, "To the Finder" in elegant script, was a handwritten letter. Elena's vision blurred as she carefully opened the envelope. Her fingers left smudges on the paper as she unfolded several pages covered in precise handwriting. The letter began simply, "If you are reading this, then I have either died, disappeared, or lost interest in returning to my old life. Regardless, these materials have sat dormant for too long, and that was never my intention." Elena read on, her breath coming in short gasps. Alexander Reed explained that the projects contained in this space represented 15 years of work he couldn't complete, some involving technology too far ahead of its time, some involving ideas that conflicted with corporate interests, some involving research that made him uncomfortable with its potential applications. He had intentionally stored these materials with the hope that eventually someone would find them. Someone without the baggage of his previous life. Someone who might approach the ideas with fresh eyes. He detailed several projects. An early prototype for neural interface technology, research into biodegradable computing components, theoretical frameworks for decentralized artificial intelligence that couldn't be monopolized by corporations. He explained that he had included access codes to the encrypted drives, hidden within the journals using a cipher he had detailed separately. The letter continued, "I urge whoever finds these materials to decide carefully what to do with them. Whether to finish the work, protect it from exploitation, share it freely, or destroy it if you believe it is dangerous. Do not let this work simply disappear into another storage unit, another corporate vault, another forgotten archive." Then came the words that would echo in Elena's mind for years to come. "If you have found this, you are meant to find it. Use your judgment, trust your instincts, and if possible, Do something good with what you have discovered. The world needs more people willing to take risks on ideas that challenge the status quo. Even if I ultimately lack the courage to see these projects through, perhaps you will find yours. Elena read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't junk. This wasn't worthless furniture and old electronics. This was potentially significant intellectual property. Research and prototypes from a person who had been successful enough to be called a billionaire. Abandoned deliberately. Left as a gift. A test. A treasure hunt with a purpose. "Mom, why are you crying?" David's voice pulled her back to reality. Elena looked up at her son, standing in the doorway of the storage unit, completely unaware that their lives might have just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She carefully repacked the boxes from the hidden space and began carrying them one by one to her car. The furniture and regular items could wait, could be dealt with later or abandoned entirely. These boxes were what mattered. As she loaded the last box into her trunk, filling every available space, Elena stood in the cold afternoon air and realized something profound. She had $27 when she walked into that auction. She had raised her hand when everyone else was silent. And now, she might be holding something worth more than she could possibly imagine. But first, she needed to find out if any of this was real. Elena drove straight to the Clearwater Public Library, a place she had spent many hours over the past few months using their free internet and warm reading rooms. It had become a refuge of sorts, somewhere she and David could exist without judgment. Without questions, without having to explain why they spent entire days there. She found a computer terminal in the far corner and logged into the guest account while David settled into the children's section with a stack of picture books. Her hands were still shaking as she typed Alexander Reed Neurosync Technologies into the search bar. What appeared on the screen made her breath catch. Alexander Reed had indeed been a significant figure in early biotechnology. The search results showed dozens of archived articles from the late 1990s and early 2000s, Forbes profiles, TechCrunch features, academic papers. He had founded Neurosync Technologies in 1998, and the company had been on the absolute cutting edge of brain-computer interface research. The kind of technology that seemed like science fiction at the time. Elena clicked through article after article, piecing together the story. In 2007, Neurosync had been acquired by a massive tech conglomerate called Apex Systems in a deal reportedly worth over $100 million. But Reed had immediately distanced himself from the merger. There was a press release, his final public statement, where he said he fundamentally disagreed with the direction the new ownership intended to take. After that, Alexander Reed had essentially vanished. No interviews, no conference appearances, no social media presence whatsoever. Speculation ranged from reasonable to bizarre. Some thought he'd retired to a private island. Others believed he'd died quietly. And conspiracy theorists claimed he'd discovered something dangerous and been silenced. But what mattered to Elena was that his previous work had been legitimate, significant, and valuable. If the materials in those boxes, now sitting in her car trunk, represented his continued research after the merger, they could be worth. She hesitated to even think the number, but she had no idea how to navigate that world. She was a homeless single mother with no connections, no credentials, no way to verify the authenticity of what she'd found. She needed an expert, someone local who could assess the materials without trying to steal them. Elena searched for Clearwater Community College Computer Science and scrolled through the faculty directory. Most professors looked too young, too corporate. Then she found someone who seemed promising, Professor Rachel Chun, specializing in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Her bio mentioned previous work in neural networks and ethical technology development. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was the best Elena could find. She opened her email and started typing, trying to sound coherent despite the insanity of her message. Dear Professor Chun, my name is Elena Torres, and I need your expert opinion on something I recently acquired. I purchased a storage unit at auction that belonged to Alexander Reed, the founder of Narration Technologies. Inside, I discovered what appears to be significant research materials, prototypes, and encrypted data that Reed deliberately preserved with instructions for the finder to evaluate. I have no technical background and no way to assess whether these materials are genuinely valuable or simply personal effects. Would you be willing to meet briefly to review what I have found? I understand this is an unusual request, but I am genuinely seeking expert guidance. She included her phone number and pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Elena didn't expect a response immediately, but her phone rang less than 20 minutes later, draining her battery to 1%. Is this some kind of prank? The voice was professional but curious. Because if you actually have materials from Alexander Reed, that would be historically and scientifically significant. Elena assured her it wasn't a prank. She explained the auction, the hidden compartment, the letter. Her words tumbled out in a rush, probably sounding half crazy, but she kept talking. There was a long pause on the other end. I can meet you this evening at my office, Professor Chun finally said. Bring 1 or 2 items, not everything. Just enough for me to assess legitimacy. If this is real, we'll need to involve university administrators and possibly legal counsel. Elena agreed, noted the address, and ended the call just as her phone died completely. She picked up David from the children's section and drove to the university campus. The gas gauge was dangerously low now, but none of that mattered compared to what might happen in the next few hours. Professor Chun's office was in the engineering building, a small cluttered space filled with books, whiteboards covered in equations, and computer equipment. The professor herself was in her 50s, wearing practical clothes and frameless glasses, with the direct manner of someone used to cutting through nonsense. Elena showed her the letter first, letting her read Alexander Reed's words without interruption. Professor Chun's expression changed as she read, shifting from polite skepticism to genuine interest, then to something that looked like excitement. She looked up at Elena, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. This handwriting matches samples I've seen in archived papers from Reed's early work, she said carefully. That doesn't prove anything definitively, but it's a very good sign. Show me what else you have. Elena opened one of the journals, displaying pages of technical notes and diagrams. Professor Chun spent several minutes examining them, occasionally pulling up reference materials on her computer, cross-referencing information, making small sounds of surprise or recognition. Where did you say you found these? Professor Chun asked without looking up. Hidden behind a false wall, in the back of the storage unit, deliberately hidden. Yes. Professor Chun continued her examination, turning pages carefully, photographing certain sections with her phone. David sat quietly in a corner chair, sensing somehow that this moment was important. After nearly an hour, Professor Chun leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. When she looked at Elena, her expression was unreadable. If these materials are authentic, and I believe they are, you've found something extraordinarily valuable, she said carefully. These journals contain research that was ahead of its time when Reed was active and remains relevant today. The prototypes you described could be historically significant for understanding the development of neural interface technology. The encrypted drives potentially contain unpublished data that researchers and institutions would pay substantial amounts to access and study. Elena felt her throat tighten. How much value? Professor Chun hesitated. I can't give you an exact number without extensive evaluation. But conservatively, if this material includes what I think it includes, you could be looking at anywhere from several million to tens of millions of dollars. Possibly more if the encrypted data contains commercially viable research. Tech museums, universities, private collectors, even corporations interested in Reed's methodologies. They would all be interested. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Elena gripped the armrests of her chair. But Professor Chun continued, "The legal question is whether you actually own it." That question hung in the air between them. Elena explained the auction process in detail, the abandoned property status, the fact that Reed had paid in advance for 15 years and then deliberately walked away, the public auction, the receipt she had. Professor Chun nodded slowly. "You would need a lawyer to confirm this, but under most abandoned property laws, once the rental period expires and the owner cannot be contacted after reasonable efforts, the contents become the property of whoever legally purchases them at auction." The fact that Reed's letter explicitly addresses the finder suggests he anticipated, and perhaps even intended this outcome. But you absolutely need legal counsel before taking any further action. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena's life transformed in ways that felt completely surreal. Professor Chun connected her with a lawyer named Michael Vance, who specialized in intellectual property and abandoned estates. Vance reviewed all the documentation, contacted Clearwater Storage Center to confirm the auction's legality, and launched an extensive search for Alexander Reed through every available channel. They found nothing. Reed had no registered next of kin, no active business entities, no property records, no bank accounts, no legal presence whatsoever. The storage unit had been his last official connection to normal society, and he had deliberately severed it. After 2 weeks of investigation, Vance confirmed what Elena barely dared to hope. She was the legal owner of everything in that unit. Word began to spread through academic and technology circles. Professor Chun, with Elena's permission, reached out to colleagues. A researcher from Stanford flew in to examine the journals. A curator from the Computer History Museum expressed intense interest in the prototypes. A documentary filmmaker wanted to interview Elena about the discovery. Several technology companies sent representatives inquiring about purchasing access to the encrypted drives. Elena found herself sitting in meetings she didn't fully understand, listening to people discuss neural interface protocols and biocomputing substrates and decentralized intelligence architectures, all while trying to remember that 3 weeks ago she'd been sleeping in her car. The university offered a partnership. Elena would maintain ownership, but they would provide resources for proper archiving, security, and evaluation. In exchange, the university would receive the first opportunity to study the materials academically, and a small percentage of any eventual sale proceeds to fund their technology ethics program. Elena agreed, too overwhelmed to negotiate, just grateful for the help. 3 months after winning the auction, Elena sat in a conference room at Clearwater Community College with a team of lawyers, archivists, technology experts, and university administrators. They presented her with a comprehensive valuation. The journals alone were worth approximately $5 million to research institutions and museums interested in the history of neural technology. The prototypes, after authentication, were valued at another $8 million. The encrypted drives, which had required considerable effort to access using the cipher, Reed had hidden in his journals, contained research data and unpublished papers that several universities and corporations were interested in licensing. Current offers totaled over $60 million. There were also patents that Reed had filed but never pursued, with potential commercial value estimated at another $7 million. Conservative total estimate, $80 million, with potential for more as additional buyers emerged. Elena had thought she was prepared for a large number, but hearing it stated so plainly made the room spin. $80 million. She had spent $27 because she wanted to stay warm. And now she owned assets worth $80 million. When? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When would this money actually ... materialize? The lead liar explained the timeline. Immediate advance payments from several institutions wanting to secure access. Formal sales and licensing deals being finalized over the next 6 months. Estate taxes and legal fees that would consume a portion, but leave her with clear ownership of the remainder. Within 30 days, she would have access to at least $10 million in verified, secured funds. The rest would follow over time. Elena and David moved into a small rental house 2 weeks later. She spent the first night walking from room to room, touching walls, opening closets, standing in the kitchen and crying. Because she had a kitchen. David had his own bedroom, his own bed, his own space filled with new clothes and toys and books. The money came through in stages. First 10 million, then another 15. Then, more as licensing deals closed and institutions finalized purchases. Elena hired a financial advisor, set up trusts, invested conservatively, established college funds for David. She had more money than she could rationally process. But she refused to live extravagantly. The trauma of sleeping in a car didn't disappear just because she had a bank account with impossible numbers. She still checked price tags obsessively. She still felt panic when the gas gauge dropped below half. She still kept emergency supplies in her car. But she also started to think about what Alexander Reed had written in his letter. Do something good with what you have discovered. And she knew exactly what she needed to do. 6 months after the auction, Elena stood in front of a small office building in downtown Clearwater, looking up at the sign being installed above the entrance. New Horizons Foundation. The name had come to her one sleepless night, thinking about how close she'd been to giving up completely. How one moment, one raised hand had opened a door to a completely different future. She wanted to create those moments for others, to give people on the edge of despair a chance to see a new horizon. The Foundation's mission was simple but comprehensive. Help single parents facing homelessness and economic desperation. Emergency housing assistance, job training programs, childcare support, legal aid. All the services Elena had desperately needed 3 months ago and couldn't find. She hired social workers and case managers, deliberately seeking out people who had themselves experienced homelessness, who understood the specific fears and needs of parents trying to protect their children while everything collapsed around them. She rented office space, created a 24-hour hotline, established partnerships with local shelters and community centers. The Foundation's first client was a woman named Maria, 34 years old, living in her van with 2 young daughters. Elena met her at a shelter and saw herself reflected back. The exhaustion, the shame, the desperate calculation in every decision. I can help, Elena said simply. Let me help. Within a week, Maria and her daughters were in temporary housing. Within a month, Maria had job training and childcare arranged. Within 3 months, she had stable employment and her own apartment. It was one family, one success story. But to Elena, it was everything. The Foundation expanded rapidly. Elena poured money into it not recklessly, but generously. She visited shelters personally, talking to people living the nightmare she had just escaped, telling them they weren't alone, that help was available, that one moment could change everything. And then the media found her story. It started with a local news segment. Homeless woman discovers $80 million fortune in storage unit. Then regional outlets picked it up. Then national networks. CNN. The Today Show. The headlines were sensational, almost absurd. From sleeping in car to multimillionaire overnight. Elena agreed to interviews, but not for the reason producers expected. She didn't want to talk about the money. She wanted to talk about what it felt like to be invisible. To count dollars for gas. To watch your child eat a single cookie like it was a feast because you both knew there might not be another meal that day. People think homelessness is about bad choices, Elena said in one interview that would go viral. But I made all the right choices. I worked hard. I saved money. I was responsible. And still, one medical emergency, one rent increase, one lost job, and suddenly I was sleeping in my car with my son. The system isn't designed to catch you when you fall. It's designed to let you keep falling. She talked about Alexander Reed, the reclusive billionaire who had deliberately left his life's work in a storage unit with instructions for the finder to do something meaningful with it. Journalists tracked down people who had known Reed's former colleagues from NeuroSync Technologies. They painted a picture of a brilliant but troubled man who had become disillusioned with how technology was being commercialized and weaponized. Someone who felt his work was being corrupted into products that exploited users rather than helped them. Reed had walked away from wealth and success because he couldn't reconcile his ethics with the industry's priorities. The storage unit, people speculated, was his way of preserving his purest work research done before corporate interests got involved, and giving it a chance to find someone who might approach it differently. It was an incredibly risky plan, profoundly unconventional, and it had worked exactly as he'd apparently hoped. 1 year after the auction, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Elena received a letter forwarded through the university's legal department. It had no return address, postmarked from a small town in northern Canada. Inside was a single handwritten page. Dear Miss Torres, I hope this letter finds you well and thriving. I have followed your story with great interest and, I must admit, considerable satisfaction. You have done exactly what I hoped someone would do, used unexpected fortune, not just for personal benefit, but to help others facing similar struggles. The foundation you have created embodies the kind of ethical thinking I always wished to see more of in the technology sector. Too often, brilliance is weaponized for profit rather than used for genuine human benefit. You have broken that pattern. I cannot reveal my current identity or location for reasons I hope you will understand and respect. But I wanted you to know that I am grateful my work found its way to someone with both need and character. The research is in good hands. The money is being used wisely. And somewhere, perhaps, my work might actually contribute to making the world slightly better rather than simply making someone richer. Continue the good work. The world needs more people like you. With respect and gratitude. The letter wasn't signed, but Elena knew who had sent it. Alexander Reed was alive, watching from whatever private exile he had chosen, satisfied that his deliberate gamble had paid off. Elena framed the letter and hung it in the New Horizons Foundation office, right next to the receipt from the storage auction, the one showing $27 paid for Unit 189. Staff members often stopped to look at those two pieces of paper, the before and after of Elena's life. Physical evidence that desperation and chance and courage could converge into transformation. The years passed. David grew older, started school, made friends, lived a normal childhood that had once seemed impossible. He remembered living in the car, but not with trauma, more with the distant curiosity children have about their own past. My mom won a treasure hunt, he would tell people, which was technically accurate if you reduced the complexity to its essential elements. Elena made sure he understood that luck had played a role, but so had courage. That raising your hand when everyone else is silent takes a kind of bravery. That taking risks, even when you're terrified, is sometimes the only path forward. The New Horizons Foundation helped hundreds of families in its first year, then thousands. Elena lobbied for policy changes, testified before city councils, worked with other nonprofits to create coordinated support networks. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking. For every success story, there were cases where she couldn't help enough, couldn't move fast enough, couldn't break through the systemic barriers that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty. But every family they helped was a vindication of her choice to raise her hand that day in the warehouse. Every child who slept in a stable home was proof that one moment of desperation transformed into opportunity could ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. 5 years after the auction, Elena stood at a podium at a fundraising gala for New Horizons. She looked out at a room full of donors, volunteers, and families who had been helped by the foundation. David sat in the front row, now 12 years old and thriving. "Everyone focuses on the money," Elena said. And yes, the money changed everything. But the real treasure wasn't in the boxes. The real treasure was the moment I decided to raise my hand. She paused, letting the words settle. Even though I was terrified, even though it seemed foolish, even though everyone was watching, that decision, that tiny act of hope or madness or courage, that was what actually changed my life. The money was just a consequence. The choice to participate, to try, to believe even for a second that something better was possible, that was the real transformation. She continued, her voice steady and clear. Alexander Reed understood something profound about human nature. He knew that people who have nothing are often the most willing to risk everything because they have the clarity that comes from desperation. He knew that someone bidding $27 at a storage auction was probably someone who needed a break, needed hope, needed a chance. His letter told me to do something good with what I found, and I've tried. But I think the real goodness was his willingness to believe that a stranger, any stranger, might be worthy of that trust. That's what I try to remember in this work. Everyone facing impossible circumstances is worthy of trust, worthy of investment, worthy of the chance to raise their hand and win something they didn't expect. The room erupted in applause. Elena stepped away from the podium, feeling the familiar mix of pride and humility that accompanied these events. She had told this story so many times, and it started to feel like something that happened to someone else. But sometimes, late at night, she would remember exactly how it felt, sitting in that warehouse with David beside her, counting her last $27, raising her hand on pure impulse, hearing the auctioneer say, "Sold." That moment remained vivid and real, untouched by time or success. That night, Elena drove home with David asleep in the passenger seat. She found herself taking a detour past Morrison's supermarket, the parking lot where they had slept in her old Toyota. The car was long gone, sold years ago. But she could still see exactly where she used to park, behind the loading docks, windows fogged with their breathing. She sat there for a few minutes, engine running, remembering that person she used to be, terrified, desperate, trying so hard to hold everything together for her son. She wanted to tell that person that everything would be okay, that help was coming in the strangest form imaginable, that in a few months she would look back on this parking lot and barely recognize the life she was living now. But she also knew that person wouldn't have believed her, couldn't have imagined the chain of events that would unfold from a single impulsive decision at a storage auction. That person was just trying to survive each day, find warmth, protect her child, hold on to the last fragments of hope. That person couldn't see the future, couldn't know that a reclusive billionaire had set up an elaborate test of faith in humanity. Couldn't imagine winning that test by accident with $27 and a raised hand. Elena pulled out of the parking lot and drove home to the house she now owned, where David had his own room and she had a kitchen, and they had heat and stability and a future. She had been that person in the parking lot, and she was this person now. Both were real, both mattered, both were part of the same story. The treasure hadn't been in the storage unit. The treasure had been the capacity to hope against hope, to take a risk when risks seemed impossible, to believe, even in the darkest moment, that something could change. Alexander Reed had given her the means to transform that belief into reality. But the belief itself, the stubborn refusal to give up completely, that had always been hers. That was what she tried to give back through the foundation. Not money, though money helped. but the reminder that transformation was possible. That one moment could change everything. That the person sleeping in a car today might be the person changing lives tomorrow. Elena tucked David into bed that night, kissed his forehead, and stood in the doorway of his room for a long moment, watching him sleep in safety and warmth. 5 years ago, she had watched him sleep in the back seat of a car, wrapped in blankets, while she counted dollars and calculated survival. The distance between those two moments seemed infinite, but it had been crossed one choice at a time. Starting with a moment of wild impulse at a storage auction, a raised hand, a winning bid, and a hidden compartment containing not just money, but proof that someone believed strangers were worth believing in. Sophie turned off the light and closed the door gently. She went to her own room, where she would sleep without fear for another night, grateful for the strange and unpredictable ways that hope sometimes disguises itself as treasure, waiting in the forgotten spaces of the world for someone desperate enough and brave enough to raise their hand and claim it.